What is up, guys? It is time for the MLB Strategy Show, where we are going to walk you through a seemingly casual 6-game slate today with, I'm sure, no curveballs coming at all. That pun wasn't even intended, but that's what happens when you wake up bright and early in the name of baseball. I'm Chris Spags, joined by a man I hadn't seen in a good 36 hours, but we are back. He is back. He is Nerd-Ass Greg Ehrenberg. How you doing, Greg?
Yeah, pretty good. And like you said, I mean, 6-game baseball slate, much more relaxed than, whatever happens in NBA slates these days, where usually I could kind of have my baseball lineup set, like a couple hours before lock. The lineups are all in, everything's set. Every once in a while, somebody gets scratched, something like that, but no weather concerns tonight. And yeah, I mean, this should be somewhat straightforward.
One can only hope, and Greg will be back at 3:45 Eastern today with Max doing the MLB Live Before Lock show, so tune into that coming up in a little bit if you need some more MLB fix, but we are going to go game by game here as always. First of all, we got to talk about some of the great deals going on at Awesemo.com right now, and you can get access to all the great Osmo Plus tools and content for nearly every DFS sport out there with an Osmo Plus weekly pass for $29.95 at Awesemo.com/join. It includes full access to the premium content and tools on Osmo, including player projections, ownership projections, premium Slack channel, lineup builder, and much more. We also have a special MMA deal running for UFC 261, Usman versus Masvidal, one of their bigger fights coming up, a rematch here that I think a lot of people think Usman will win. I'm sure Greg has some thoughts too. That's coming up on April 24th, so get 50% off your first month of Osmo Plus MMA when you use the promo code UFC 261. That is $14.98 for 30 days of Osmo Plus MMA, which includes our fighter projections, ownership projections, and the top fighters tool, which is a lot like the top stacks tool, and it combines projected ownership with the chances of any fighter being one of the top fighters on the slate. This offer is only valid through this Saturday, April 24th, so stop guessing, start winning, join Osmo Plus today. And Greg, I have to presume you're Team Usman here.
Yeah, I think he's a minus 400 favorite the last I looked. And also, I mean, they fought a year ago, and it was not an overly competitive fight, not really remotely competitive, so I don't really see anything that would have changed by then.
Yeah, definitely a nice payday for both guys here, but does seem a bit perhaps more like a fight that will be more for the pay-per-view eyes than for the actual quality of the championship fight. Hey, still tune in there and hopefully win some money playing the MMA slates as well. Anything jumping out to you with this slate, Greg, before we go game by game here? I feel like this is one where, not the biggest pitching slate when you're going to have Danny Duffy being the chalk play of the day. I think that's going to be how that goes. But any noteworthy little angles or things that you picked up doing your prep so far?
Just one note for Fanduel is that they randomly included the Oakland-Minnesota game, which isn't even being played today. It's being played tomorrow, and all the players are going to get 0 fantasy points. So it is a little confusing there. I know for me, when I opened up Fantasy Cruncher and started building the Fanduel lineups for today so that I had just kind of a basis of who I think I could be targeting later, I was like, why is this game in the player pool? And then I go over to FanDuel and I see that, they just randomly included in there. It's a game that's being played tomorrow, and all the players get 0 fantasy points. So, don't go roster them.
That's good to know. Or, if you want to be contrarian, roster them all. I think that would be the way. And, maybe every other player in the slate grade gets negative points. We just don't know.
Yeah, that would definitely be one way to go about it, which we've seen pitching slates like that before, right? I mean, there was the one with Ponce de Leon last weekend where it's like, well, I wish I would have just rostered, because he scored negative 18 DraftKings points. I was like, well, I wish I would have just rostered the guys from the rained out Mets game that day.
Unfortunately, fortunately, no Daniel Ponce de Leon today, but let's go game by game here. We got our first game up, San Francisco, 4.2 implied runs going against Chase Anderson. And Chase Anderson, boy, is he not a good pitcher. And I feel like this is going to be perhaps a refrain I say a few times here throughout the show, but Chase Anderson against righties giving up a 5.7 xFIP, a 260 ISO versus lefties is not much better. Does give up less walks and hits with just a 1.15 whip, but a 4.6 xFIP, a 200 ISO allowed to lefties as well. And he does not pitch terribly deep in the games, probably because in part of giving up a lot of production through the last 2020 season to the present. A 290 batting average allowed, a 7% home run rate for Chase Anderson. So going to San Francisco, Greg, does seem like a pretty decent spot here. These guys, I think the Giants maybe not getting enough recognition for their park factors that have benefited them, but they just have a lot of quality hitters up top now with Tommy La Stella, Yastrzemski. You also have Dickerson, Brandon Bell. Really, any of these guys, I wouldn't mind getting into a lineup just because of the power that they have going against Anderson. And even going down the order, I mean, you do have some decent price points on the Brandon Crawfords, Buster Posies, Austin Slater too, not too terribly priced. How are you feeling about this Giant stack? Because they do have one of the chances of being the top stack, one of the best chances rather, being the top stack on the slate, and the ownership doesn't look too oppressive in any way. So to me, going against Chase Anderson seems like one of the better spots right away.
Yeah, well, first off, the regression of Chase Anderson, who for a very brief period of time was actually a viable major league pitcher, is pretty funny because just, I mean, going off his ERA, so going back to 2017, 2.74 ERA. It's like, oh, young pitcher, he actually looks kind of decent. Next year, 3.93 ERA. It's like, all right, he regressed a little bit, and also his peripheral numbers got way worse that year. Then 2019, a 4.21 ERA. Then last year, heads over to Toronto with a 7.22 ERA. So the deterioration of Chase Anderson has been pretty quick. There was a lot of stuff in his peripheral numbers that suggested that he was going to regress a little bit, but maybe not quite to this extent. But yeah, to what you said, I mean, San Francisco right now, they project really well as a top stack, at least for on FanDuel. They project as the top value stack by a really wide margin. They have an 18% chance of being the top value stack on the slate, and there's not another team that's coming in over 10%. So for them, at least on a points per dollar basis, they look like the best value on FanDuel. And then on DraftKings, they're priced a little bit more appropriately, but still going under owned. So we have them with an 11% chance to be the top scoring stack on the slate, but only picking up 9% ownership as a team. So I think there's a lot of reasons to roster the Giants on both FanDuel and DraftKings. DraftKings, because they're going under owned. FanDuel, they just look like the best values by a pretty wide margin.
Does it seem to you like Tommy LaStella in particular looks underowned on DraftKings? And I feel like he's a player that, maybe there's something I'm missing with him. But when he was an Angel in particular, I feel like I never minded getting him in stacks, and he would always be underowned and always, I think right there. Obviously, no Mike Trout, no Ohtani, but still a guy who does get decent results. A 204 ISO versus righties, a little bit of home run power, 4.2% home run rate. So, better than league average. He doesn't strike out a lot either, only an 8% K rate over the last couple seasons. He's only going to be 5% owned on DK. So that to me is surprising. He's in the leadoff spot. He's not too expensive. I don't get why he would be one of the lower owned guys in this Giants lineup, but does he or does anybody else stand out for you as being a bit underappreciated in terms of this Giants stack?
Yeah, I mean, it would be cool if Google Chrome didn't just totally crash on me. So everything
Did you update it? Because it's running like crap for me too.
I don't know what it is, but so I've had this issue for, I want to say the last week or so. Like I'll be doing a show and I just have all the stuff up. So I usually have Fangraphs up, and then I usually have the tools in our site up. And then I have Fantasy Cruncher up, just where I look at like, hey, here are the lineups I've built so far. And here are the exposures I have, just because it's an easy way to be like, hey, when I'm stacking this team, this is the percentage I'm getting to them. This is the amount I'm getting to each individual team. And for whatever reason, Google Chrome just stinks right now to where, like every couple of shows I do or something, it just closes all of my windows. And then I'm just looking at nothing. But I mean, it's not terrible that I'm looking at your face on the screen, but I need other things to go off of. Like I can't just profit in DFS by looking at your face. And I'm trying to stall time as Google Chrome resets all my things, but it's so annoying. But
I'll tell you what happened. I updated this morning and I was doing my basketball prep too, as well, just pulling in the data just so I could have that to jump into after I finish this show and the MLB Four Corners, which will be coming out shortly after this video does, our short form video where I run through the top stacks, top pitchers, all those things that we talk about on here. And yeah, like I was just pasting in the dates, the different rate datas for these guys from Basketball Reference, and it just kept crashing. Like it just kept crashing while doing a copy paste, like a simple, like line by line, selecting it to copy paste. I don't know what happened with Google Chrome, but whatever this update was, because it was legitimately, I did the update and then all of a sudden it just went to shit. So don't update your Google Chrome would be my recommendation right now.
Yeah, well, anyway, I had to rebuild the lineups now I had all the exposures and everything put in, but it's just rerunning it now, so I have an idea of who those players are that I actually like. But the other things to what I said about the Giants, that still holds true in terms of them being under-owned on DraftKings, a really good value on FanDuel. Individual players that I'm getting to, let's see, of the lineups I've run so far, who am I getting from the Giants? Yeah, it is. Is there like an alternative? Because like Internet Explorer is terrible. Like Firefox. I don't find works particularly well either. But I don't even like what do you think is the best browser use so that everything doesn't just go to shit while I'm in the middle of doing shows?
I would think you have to switch to Firefox, and they make it easy to import everything now, though. I guess TBO marketing saying that the Chrome update is because of the 0-day virus. So I guess the good news is you're not having whatever malware that's out there. But on a Mac, I don't really care that much. I think for the most part, I don't know. Either way, I'm mad at Google Chrome. Greg's mad at Google Chrome. That's the main thing that we're talking about here. And unfortunately, I guess you don't have the answer to these Giants questions that we want to talk about.
But we killed just enough time for me to bring this up. So yeah, Tommy LaStella is somebody who's coming up as a core piece of my Giant stacks. The guys that I have the most exposure though to in San Francisco stacks, Brandon Belt and Brandon Crawford. Brandon Belt more so. He's so cheap on DraftKings at 3,400. Also, Brandon Belt, somebody who's been, a well above average hitter for a really long time in the big leagues. His power's gotten suppressed at home for a little while just because left-handed power has been really difficult to really show up in the box score when you're playing half your games in San Francisco. But now that the walls have been moved in a little bit, I expect his counting stats could be a little bit better going forward. But either way, this is a road game in Philly against a weak pitcher in Chase Anderson, also a really strong hitter's park, Philadelphia. So Brandon Belt to me is the overall top play on the Giants.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable here. And I would agree. I think that, you could sort of make the case for some of the other guys, but the price point of Belt, you're giving up that first baseman spot on DraftKings with 3,400, a nice price tag for a guy who's probably got as much of a ceiling as anybody else out there. And Belt's hitting over the last year, to Greg's point, because of the park being a little bit better, as we've talked about in a previous strategy show, that San Francisco's home park appreciably better for hitting over that pandemic season, something that maybe a lot of people out there miss. I think including sometimes Vegas, the Lions don't seem to reflect that when they are playing in San Francisco, but Belt's over the last season and change, a 273 ISO, 290 batting average, 406 OBP. Like, he's been doing a lot of stuff looking better. 162 WRC plus. He is looking like the best version of himself over the last season and change. And obviously that's a smaller sample size when you can point to the fact that his park is now a lot better for a guy like him. It does seem like Belt finally getting the results that you'd expect him to get. So yeah, I think Belt's a fine play here. Any interest at all in Chase Anderson, just given the fact that this is something that with the Giants, where it wouldn't shock me to see the ownership come up throughout the day because they seem like an obvious play that maybe in the morning is not as obvious to people. But Chase Anderson, does have league average strikeout ability, a 22.9% K rate. And we talked about all the bad of him, but it is still a spot where a guy could get strikeouts against a Giants lineup that does have a 27% aggregate K rate and has the pitcher in there as well with Gausman. 62% K rate for him is a pretty big number. Is there any world where you see yourself getting any Chase Anderson at all?
I don't think so. He has basically no ownership, but there's also other pitchers with really low ownership that I like more than him. So, like, we're going on the high end, Dustin May. We'll talk about him later. He's picking up almost no ownership. Joe Ross, I liked him the other day. And if I'm going for a cheap pitcher to pick up no ownership, I'd rather go with Joe Ross than Chase Anderson. Basically almost any other pitcher on the slate I roster before Anderson.
Okay. Yeah. And we got to give Greg some credit for Joe Ross too, because he called him the last time on the show. And I think he had like 10 strikeouts in that game or something like that. Just an outrageous numbers for Joe Ross. He'll be the pitcher we talk about in the next game. But let's go to the Philadelphia side of this equation, going against Kevin Gausman. And Gausman's numbers over the pandemic season through today, looking a lot better. A 30% K rate, a 1.03 whip. Compare that to the longer term sample size where he had the strikeout ability, a 27.4% K rate, was giving up more walks and hits with a 1.3 whip, also giving up some more hard contact. It seems like Gausman has plugged some holes in his offering overall. He's going against a Philadelphia lineup that doesn't have a lot of guys who strike out above league average. Only 4 guys in their lineup striking out above league average. But I think you can make a case to go to Gausman here. He's not at a terrible price point. The projection from Osmo looks pretty good. He's certainly capable of giving up a little bit of power, but I think the strikeout ability here, the numbers, the strikeout rate in particular, aren't a lot of guys with big strikeout numbers on the slate. So I think I'd be willing to take some flyers on Gausman, even though I do think you're probably going to get some Philadelphia too.
Yeah. So first off, for FanDuel, no reason to consider Gausman to me where we only have to roster one pitcher on DraftKings. We're already the pitching's pretty poor, and we need SP2s. He's cheap enough. The matchup is less than ideal. It's a hitter's park. Also, Philly has a good offense. They also don't strike out a ton. But Gausman's pitched well enough that I think that he's worth as a low priority SP2. I do think he's going a little bit over-owned because it looks like he's going to be popular on DraftKings. So he's going to be my player pool, but probably not as much as the field has. But really, to me, the biggest significance of Gausman and his ability to pitch at least fairly decently over the last couple of years is that we have the Phillies having the largest negative leverage score of any stack on the slate. So they're pretty popular, picking up about 11% ownership on FanDuel, but then also only having an 8% chance of being the top scoring team on the slate. And then on DraftKings, also 8% chance of being the top scoring team on the slate, and then 9.2% ownership share. So both FanDuel and DraftKings, it looks like the Phillies are going over-owned. So I think that's a team to be underweight to the field too.
Yeah, and I think that's reasonable to not want to go crazy on Gausman, given the ownership for him. About a quarter of the field will be on him. But given the fact is, again, we mentioned earlier in the show, it's chalk Danny Duffy day. I do think Gausman at least has shown some strikeout ability. It's going to be tougher for him, but there are certainly some ways to get leverage against an overowned Philadelphia team and also get Gausman, whose strikeout stuff has just been good. The numbers for him surprisingly good, I would say, in a way that I wouldn't have expected unless you dug deeper on him. Philadelphia, though, if we were to stack them up, as Greg mentioned, they are a bit overowned on both sites, less overowned on DraftKings and Fanduel, but still both the number for their chances of being a top stack lower than their ownership overall. But you do see a lot of the ownership going to that top five, not a lot going to guys like Didi Gregorius, Jean Segura, Mickey Moniak down at the bottom of the order. Don't know that there's any reason to go to those guys, but Greg, I feel like if you were to stack the Phillies, just based on the ownership, I'd be more inclined to go to a 3-man than a 5-man. And I think maybe leaving out an Alec Boehm, who I feel like is always kind of thrown into these stacks because he's cheap, but he really hasn't shown a lot of power at all. Only a .093 ISO versus righties in about 200 at bats so far for Boehm. I feel like, I don't know, like I don't love the Philly stack overall, but I just think I really don't love a 5-man Philly stack.
Yeah, it's really hard. And I mean, looking at the top stacks tool, it looks like a team to not really be high on because they're going overowned. And then I start to build lineups in Fantasy Crunch. We're also using the optimizer, and it's hard to get to them because the players are so expensive. So like I always think you could make a case for using Bryce Harper as a one-off, but still, he's really expensive. He's one of the most expensive hitters on the slate. Then JT Realmuto, really expensive 5,100 at catcher spot. So I mean, all of these guys, and like Didi Gregorius, he's also really expensive, and he hits towards the bottom of the order. He's been hitting 6 for them. So just from a value perspective, like these are really poor points per dollar plays also. So it looks like Kevin Gausman getting underrated in the pricing algorithm, and as well as by the masses, it just leads to too high of prices on the Phillies and also too much ownership.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think really a one-off here would be my ideal, but I think the case could be made for 3-man stacks. Like I never mind going to Rhys Hoskins, who has been a pretty poor hitter versus righties in terms of just getting batting average up. 212 batting average for him is not a good number. The power also significantly worse than his splits versus lefties, but still, a guy does have some degree of pop. But I feel like really Bryce Harper, I'm with you, I think is the one that jumps out here. And Real Muto, I don't want to pay 5,100 at catcher for him either. So not the most appealing stack, but going to be owned like they are very appealing. So that could be the case to move away. Let's keep going through here. And guys, smash that like button here. The MLB Strategy Show and the MLB DFS community, definitely a quieter one at this point of year with the NBA still going full bore. So show a little love, hit that like button here. And of course, make sure to tune into that Live Before Lock show coming up later today with Greg and Max, 3:45 Eastern time will be when they take you guys in through everything else that breaks and changes over the next couple hours. We got our next game up, St. Louis 4 implied runs against Joe Ross. And we got on the other side, Washington 4.1 implied runs against Jack Flaherty. But I think we got to talk more about Joe Ross because these numbers now, and it is very small sample size ball. He didn't pitch last year. This year, though, he's only faced 40 batters, but boy, the numbers are insane for this 40 batter split for him with a .82 whip, 3.5 xFIP, only a 160 batting average. The strikeout rate hasn't taken a big jump, even though he showed last game. I guess he does have a ceiling there. Only a 22.5% strikeout rate, still under league average, but no home runs allowed. I feel like Joe Ross is going to regress, Greg, but you have been a bit of a Joe Ross whisperer in previous shows, so I'll give you the chance here to tell me if Joe Ross is going to have one more big day against a Cardinals lineup that does have 6 guys in it that strike out above league average and a park that also should help him out too.
Probably not. However, right now we are, and by the way, also kind of similar with Kevin Gausman. No reason to consider Joe Ross on FanDuel, but as an SP2 on DraftKings, we have him projected for 1% ownership right now, and he's an 8% chance of being the top scoring pitcher on the slate. So, I mean, getting to 5%, 6%, 7% Joe Ross, I have no issue with that. And that's 7x what the field is going to be on him. And I think that that's somebody who is going underrepresented in terms of his actual odds of being in the optimal lineup. And then this is actually really similar to the other slate where we talked about Joe Ross too, where I think that was like a 4 or 5 game slate. But I said, like, I don't think that Joe Ross is going to be a great pitcher going forward, but he was so low owned on a slate that had such bad pitching options that it was a thing where it's like, I don't think that these other guys are, 20x the odds of landing in the optimal lineup to Joe Ross. And this is almost the exact same thing. The pitching options are bad. He's projected for 1% ownership. So you throw him in a couple of lineups, you're overweight to the field on him. And I think that it's not really represented in his total upside, what his ownership is. So now looking at him individually as a pitcher, the one thing that I said last slate that had me a little bullish on him overall is just that really long layoff for him. He's dealt with a ton of injuries. But to start the season, the velocity has been there for him. His average fastball velocity is at 93.2 miles per hour, which is actually slightly up over the course of his career for his entire career, 92.9 mile per hour average fastball, and it's up slightly from that. So I think he's healthy, and I think there's a case to be made also with a guy who's dealt with so many injuries in his career. I think that opting out of last year because of COVID concerns and getting a full year off to really get himself healthy, I think that maybe has a little bit of benefit to him here, at least to start the season. That might be going overlooked.
Yeah, I think the numbers that jump out to me as being concerning is he's still not getting a lot of swinging strikes, a 7% swinging strike rate, which is actually down from 10% over the longer term sample size. And he's been getting pretty lucky on batting average on balls in play too, only a 210 BABIP for him compared to a 331. But I agree, like on a short slate, I don't love the price point on DK being up to 8K, but I didn't love it last time either. And he did come through with another solid day. And I just think this Cardinals lineup breaks pretty well for him, where you have a 23% aggregate K rate. But as I mentioned, just 6 guys who strike out above league average. So if he can kind of just keep people off their toes, maybe there isn't enough film on him yet with whatever changes he's made during his time. I think you could get one more useful Ross start. I still expect over the long term he's going to drop down, but I guess I just don't hate playing him today. And it seems like an aberration, Greg, but I feel like we just got to talk about Joe Ross because it is the results are there right now, even if it is only 40 batters faced this year.
Yeah, and once again, I don't think that he's going to be like a top of the line starting pitcher this year. I just think he's going to be viable in the rotation, and he's going to get hurt at some point too, right? Like we've seen that throughout his entire career. At some point this season, he's going to get hurt. But if there's one time for him to ever be healthy in his career, it's going to be at the start of the season after he opted out of the year before and hasn't pitched in 2 years. So with the velocity up and the health looking in check, I think that he's worth rostering more than the 1% of the field. More than 1% of the field is getting to him as an SP2 on DK.
Yeah, and still not a great projection from Awesemo. So definitely, your mileage may vary here. Don't go crazy on Joe Ross, but there are some signs that maybe he's working his off-speed stuff better. There are some things here that the overarching numbers won't necessarily give you, but that could be there with Joe Ross, and the matchup does benefit him today. He's going against a Cardinals team that has an 11% chance of being the top stack, and on DraftKings, a slightly lower ownership for them right now, though not a lot here. And again, this is one too. As the updates come in throughout the day, make sure you're checking the top stacks tool because a team can go from a positive leverage to negative leverage pretty fast. I don't love the Cardinals though, Greg. I feel like the 11% chance of being a top stack, I'm kind of surprised to see it being that high, given that you only have one hitter who's got an ISO above 200. And I guess if you want to count Paul DeJong, who has a 200 ISO flat, 2 hitters, but Nolan Arenado, the only guy who jumps out with a 245 ISO versus righties. And some of that inflated by his Coors days where you're seeing the ball a little better over the last year has not been the case for him. I just don't like the Cardinals on most slates here. And I feel like their price points, they're priced like a team. They're priced like the Dodgers. And I just don't get it against Joe Ross, who might be better too. And only a 4-run implied total for St. Louis. I don't like the stack. And I get they have good top stack odds, but I'd prefer San Francisco based on what we talked about earlier.
Yeah, so I prefer San Francisco. St. Louis isn't a fade for me or anything like that, though. It's just a team that, to me at least, because I rely very heavily on the top stacks to when I'm building my lineups, it's just a team to be neutral on. Like you said, about 10% ownership share and about a 10% chance of being the top scoring team on both Fanduel and DraftKings. So to me, just a neutral team, a team that if I was making 20 lineups, I'd have probably 2 stacks of them, and I'd feel fairly decently about that. Like, this isn't a team I'm making a big stance on. Relative to ownership, I do prefer the Joe Ross side a little bit, but overall, I don't think Joe Ross is the guy to have in like 50% of your lineups. I don't think the Cardinals are a team to go out of your way to stack either. So overall, it's actually something that I don't have a ton of interest in.
Yeah, I'm with you. I guess if we were to, to try to talk about the guys who prioritize, if you are more interested here, I do think that Nolan Arenado would be one that I would want to prioritize. I feel Paul Goldschmidt probably a little more upside at his price. So the numbers, he's a guy that really the shorter term sample going back to last season would concern me quite a bit. 144 ISO from him going back to 2020. And the home run rate too, down to 2.4%. Some of that could be playing a lot more games, at the Cardinals home stadium, but still, I don't know. Like, I feel like it would still be Goldschmidt and Arenado, but these guys are priced like they are the players of yore, and I just don't think they are.
Yeah, kind of this. So kind of similar with somebody like Matt Carpenter in terms of a guy who is not good anymore, but he continues to hit in a premier lineup spot and he's really cheap. So at least as a value play, I think there's reason to get to Matt Carpenter. The issue is that it's been about a week since he's gotten a hit now, which is a little bit of a concern. But as long if they're going to keep hitting him, like 4th or 5th in the lineup, it's pretty hard for me to totally avoid him when he's 3,100 on DraftKings. And then On the Paul Goldschmidt thing, I don't know if you have this, I don't know if you have a bias like this in terms of me, in terms of athletes. When somebody has a bunch of hair and then all of a sudden they start to lose that hair, there's something about it to me where it's like, that's a red flag. Like when I see like Daniel Cormier towards the end of his MMA run, where it's like, boy, his cardio doesn't look good and his hair's falling out really quick. I feel like there's some sort of correlation there, but Paul Goldschmidt anyway falls in the same category. Guy who's losing his hair pretty rapidly.
Counterpoint, LeBron James would be the one that I would say where he has fought that back for a while, seemingly put some AstroTurf on there, whatever he's done. And I would say he's the one bald athlete. And I guess Drew Brees, too, you can make a case, though, he's been most bald most recently, and he's been clearly pretty bad. So I think those two would be my pushback on your balding theory, on your George Costanza theory, we can call it.
So the difference, though, is like LeBron started balding when he was like in high school. He's just been filling it in for a while. So like this has just kind of been the status quo for him. Also like Kevin Durant, like these guys have just been going bald for a long time. But when somebody's in their 30s and it's like they had a bunch of hair, then it falls out really quickly. To me, I look at it like, oh, there's some sort of physical deterioration going on here.
It could be. I mean, I don't know enough about this stuff. Thankfully, I have far too much hair, despite how it may look right now with me wearing a hat all the time. But I feel like that's one thing that I know in the ads that pop up on Instagram when you are a guy over your 30s, you get those Roman ads or whatever, and they're like, your testosterone has fallen off of a cliff, and maybe that's tied to athletic performance here. These guys are just not as teed up, and now they're losing their hair, and now just a real double whammy for guys like Paul Goldschmidt. Thankfully, he'll have the hundreds of $1 million to fall back on, so he can fix it up whenever he wants. Any cheap guys here at the bottom of the order appeal? I feel like Paul DeJong is another one I can make a case for, though he's going to be the highest owned Cardinal. So this team is a real damned if you do, damned if you don't team. But DeJong at least has some power, cheaper at shortstop. I feel like that's the one case I could really make here, besides the longer term track record of a Goldschmidt or Arenado. But any of these cheap guys, a Dylan Carlson, a DeJong, a Justin Williams, do any of them seem worthwhile to you?
Let's see. Who am I getting to of the cheaper guys, if anybody? Yadi Molina, I think, is a viable catching option. There isn't any one player, though. Actually, Tommy Edman a little bit as a pay-up option in my lineups, but there is no one guy on the Cardinals that I'm getting to like a whole bunch outside of the few stacks that I have in my build right now. There's nobody who's standing out as a one-off.
Tommy Edman on DK is 5,300.
I know.
That's absurd. I don't get it. I don't get the pricing. I don't get the ownership. I don't get the top stack odds, but that's your St. Louis Cardinals. So maybe I might be more team Joe Ross than I realized. The national side, I think, a better hitting team against a better pitcher. So that's sort of the pairing you don't want to see. But Jack Flaherty, 28% K rate over the last season and change. That's down a little bit from the longer term sample size, just under a 30% K rate going back to 2019 with a 29.5% strikeout rate for him, 14% swing strike rate. No reason to believe those numbers are an aberration for Flaherty. And I would think that he's going to have better days here to come. I feel like the numbers down a little bit over the shorter term sample size, but nothing that worries me too much. I think the walks and hits can come down, just getting some better matchups. And I guess the issue, though, Greg, is that he's going against Washington. So let's talk about the Flaherty part of the side first, where projection looks good. The price point looks pretty good. Ownership, not too onerous here. Flaherty projected for under 20% on DK. I feel like there's a case to be made for Flaherty, other than the fact that he's just facing Washington, and they have enough guys here that could make a day bad pretty fast.
Yeah, I mean, just based on what his ownership is and the overall weak pitching options on the slate, Jack Flaherty to me is somebody to get overweight to on the field in GPPs on DraftKings. Fanduel, I think that he, even on a one pitcher site, I think he's worth some exposure to as a GPP option. Let's see, what was his ownership there? At least when I looked earlier, it was really low. Yeah, he's only picking up 11% ownership on Fanduel. So at those kind of numbers, and Jack Flaherty, a guy who's been an ace caliber starting pitcher for a little while in the big leagues, I think he's worth getting to, mostly because, I mean, if we're paying up, like the pay up option on the slate is Joe Musgrove at pitcher. And there's nothing wrong with Joe Musgrove. He's thrown a no-hitter this year. He's really, he's a pretty solid starting pitcher, but I don't think he's better than Jack Flaherty is. He's a better matchup today than Jack Flaherty. But I mean, when we're looking at Joe Musgrove on DraftKings as chalk priced at 10,200, like, I don't think that's a warranted price tag for somebody like Musgrove. So within that context, like, yeah, I think Jack Flaherty is worth being overweight to the field too, even though the matchup is absolutely brutal, which is the concern. That's the reason he's high risk. It's also the reason that his ownership is lower, because people just say like, hey, he's on the road pitching in Washington, therefore I don't want to roster him. But then on the other side also, I think Washington's going under-owned as a stack. If we look at them in the top stacks tool, right now only picking up 5% ownership, but a 7.5% chance of being the top stack on the slate. So I see a lot of GPP upside here. I think there's reason to roster Flaherty. I also think that there's reason to stack up the Nationals. If you're playing a single entry, I wouldn't stack the Nationals, nor would I roster Flaherty. But if you're like me and you're playing multiple lineups, I think it's a situation to be overweight to both sides of.
Yeah, I think that's one that we talk about sometimes in the show that I think the most recent one where he hit on it was the Arrieta versus Milwaukee Brewers matchup where there were some strikeouts in that lineup. Arrieta ended up getting, I think, 5 strikeouts in that spot, but then also give him a couple home runs. And that's just how it goes sometimes where you could see sort of the merits to a guy who's got the strikeout numbers and you could see the merits to the lineup that has some power. Now I would agree here. I would think playing this lineup or playing the slate rather, I would want a good amount of Nationals and a good amount of Flaherty and just obviously not in the same lineups, but I think you can sort of target volatility here on both sides. And that's what happens when you have a good matchup on both parts here. But let's talk about this national stack then, because we mentioned the Flaherty concerns, the fact that he's been a good strikeout guy, doesn't give up crazy power, only a 3.4% home run rate rather over the last season and change. So just a bit above league average at the 2.9%. But the national side has a lot of guys with power in that 2, 3, 4 hole in particular. You have Soto, Bell, Schwarber, all those guys over 264 ISO combined, or, individually rather. And so the exact opposite of what I said, individually not combined, but they are each above 264 ISOs against right-handed pitching. Not a lot of strikeouts either. This team does on the top of the order. Trey Turner, Soto, Bell. You also have Harrison, Castro, all those guys in our league average strikeout rates. I feel like going to Washington as a 5-man stack looks appealing to me. The 3-man's still going to be under owned. I think you could sort of take Washington however you want them. You get one-offs here. I think getting pieces of Washington in lineups without Flaherty is going to be a pretty good move to have on the slate.
Yeah. I mean, if we look at some of these guys individually, like Trey Turner, I think he's the highest upside shortstop option for this slate. Juan Soto, if you have the salary for him, I think he's a good guy to pay up for. It is hard to get to these guys individually, though, just because they're so expensive. And Jack Flaherty is still a quality starting pitcher. The guy that I'm getting to the most from the Nationals in my lineups right now is Josh Bell, who's reasonably priced on Fanduel and Draftkings. Was a guy who was a former top prospect and then never really materialized until a couple of years ago. Kind of had a breakout season for the Pirates. Then he regressed last year. Now he finds himself on the Nationals. And just given the overall quality of this lineup, I like him to have a bounce back year. We haven't really seen all that much from him so far this season, but just where the price point is and that he's hitting in the middle of a pretty potent lineup, he's the guy that I want to get the most exposure to from this team.
Yeah, Josh Bell would be a guy I would think would be due for some positive regression given the shorter term sample size going back to last year, as Greg mentioned. Only a 130 ISO, 214 batting average, a sub 300 on base percentage. But over the last couple seasons against right-handed pitching, a 264 ISO, 362 on base percentage. So if you are buying in on the new Josh Bell, or you would want to be under the field on him, if you are buying in on him regressing back to what he was previously, and the Pirates here in particular is the one that I think stands out most meaningfully here. I think trying to get to Bell a little bit more, 6% ownership going his way. I also don't hate Schwarber at, just 1% ownership. We know the power he has. He has some of the best power here, I guess, besides Soto in the lineup. Like Schwarber looks a little bit underappreciated. The bottom of the order, I don't really think there's much of a case to be made. If you get a Yan Gomes or anybody like that, I think that's fine. But Schwarber to me just stands out here. 1% ownership, as much pop as anybody in the lineup. I think he's just as likely to get to Flaherty as any of these guys.
Yeah, I mean, for the ownership, sure. But he's also really expensive on DraftKings. I think FanDuel a little less so. If I remember off the top of my head, Kyle Schwarber on FanDuel is at 3,200. So at that price point, I actually think that he's one of the better one-offs on FanDuel. But DraftKings at 4,900. Once again, I think, like, to your point, 1% ownership, yeah, fine being overweight to the field on such a low number. But more of a priority play for me on FanDuel just because the price is $1,700 cheaper.
Eric, this is the thing. This has been an ongoing bit on the tip-off recently because our friend Kayla, big Cardinals fan, and I am very, very vocal about disliking Cardinals fans. And you can follow the @bestfansinbaseball Twitter handle if you want to see perhaps part of why I'm not the hugest fan on them. But Eric Smith, obsessed with me being wrong about the card stack. Card stack will smash tonight. Thanks, guys, for not playing them. Usually agree with Spags, but he's way off base in his Cardinals lineup takes. You can like your team, but I think it's fair to acknowledge the fact that this team is so much worse than what they should be based on name value. value. I mean, just the 2020 sample size to now, not a single hitter over a 200 ISO. Like it's not a good team. They don't have good park factors at home either. So you can sort of take your claims to that. But we did like Flaherty. I feel like we're not totally Cardinals biased here. I like Flaherty. I just think the Cardinals hitting is crap, and they are always so overrated. And I don't mind them on a slate where, you have a bunch of teams you're trying to get a pivot point, but if they're going to be owned a lot, I just don't want to play the Cardinals ever.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to talk about potential bias, I did bet them at plus 220 to miss the playoffs when the odds first opened up at sportsbooks before the season. So I think they're probably more likely to make the playoffs than miss, but a plus 220 odds to miss, I think that was a misprice. But overall, yeah, I think the Cardinals are not quite as good as the public perceives them.
Yeah, same page for me. But you know what? For guys like Eric Smith or any other Cardinals fans out there who want to find out how their team ranks, one of the biggest edges in sports betting that you can get is to find the best line for yourself. So go get yourself some Cardinals odds at OddsShopper.Osmo.com, because betting lines change by the minute, can vary greatly depending upon which book you're using. So if you're using a St. Louis sports book, they're probably just going, oh, the Cardinals are favorite to win the World Series, better than the Dodgers, because they're delusional assholes who live out in St. Louis. But that is the case where you could shop for your lines, find the best odds on OddsShopper.Osmo.com, and you can find your player props, find your futures bets, find all of that stuff. They're all updated in real time, so make sure to go to OddsShopper.Osmo.com and check those things out and back it with your pocketbook, as I always say. And let's get on to our next game. Tampa Bay, 3.5 implied runs against DraftKings chalk pitcher Danny Duffy. 5 guys who strike out above league average in this Tampa Bay lineup, a low 3.5 implied total for Tampa Bay. I don't get any part of this Danny Duffy thing. I don't get the projection from Awesemo. It's a very generous projection for Danny Duffy. The strikeout stuff for him, there's no Joe Rossing here. He's only at 23% K rate over the last season. Going back to 2019, a 21% K rate. Duffy pitches fairly deep into games, I guess, is one note you can give to him, one credit to him, but I just don't see how this many people are going to be casting their lot with Duffy tonight. Like, I don't get it. Greg, do you feel differently here, other than the fact that I guess he could just hang in well enough and have a decent day and pick up 5 strikeouts, but I just don't get this Duffy ownership.
Yeah, it's pretty insane. So, and it's not even to say that, like, hey, 7,000 for Danny Duffy. You just give me the prices of players and don't give me any other information. You say Danny Duffy is 7,000 against the Rays. Do you have interest in him? Do you not have interest in him? And to me, I'd say, yes, I think that is a viable price point. The pitching options are very crappy on this slate. But then I look at the projected ownership, and he's projected for 40% ownership. So nearly half of the lineups are going to have Danny Duffy in them. He's the most popular pitcher on the slate. To me, I just assume that number is going to be different later on in the day when the ownership gets updated. If this actually does hold until lock, though, then I'm going to have a lot of exposure to the Tampa Bay Rays, because I think one of the easiest ways to find leverage in MLB DFS is you stack against mediocre chalk pitchers. And it doesn't mean that Danny Duffy sucks. It doesn't mean that the Rays are in the best spot in the world. The ownership here is just wrong, though, if this is actually what it holds to until lock. So if half the field is going to be rostering Danny Duffy, it is not hard to get leverage by just going to what is right now projecting to be an under-owned Rays stack in our top stacks. Well, and the reason it's going under-owned is because everybody's rostering Danny Duffy. So as of right now, I think that's the easiest way to get tournament leverage on this slate.
Yeah, I would agree here. And I think, this Rays lineup, I just don't, the Vegas total is very low. So I will say that's one thing here that I know that's sort of what the foundation block of a lot of what we do here. I think it's a little more volatile in MLB, as we see, night in, night out on some of the other sports out there. But you do have a Rays team that has a lot of guys that have shown some power against lefties. Arozarena is a very limited sample size guy, only 45 at bats against a lefty, but 436 ISO for him. They also have Brousseau in the lineup today, 256 ISO versus lefties, 6% home run rate. Meadows has hit lefties pretty well, better than you would think for a fellow lefty. Yandy Diaz, even in the leadoff spot, I feel like a 154 WRC plus against lefties, pretty good number. Manuel Margot is cheap. Like, I like this Rays stack. I do think that there's a merit to go in them, even if they weren't going against one of the chalk or surprising chalk pitchers of the slate. But Greg, how do you feel about this Rays stack? Because on the top stack stool, they're not looking the best. They do look good in terms of value, but a good amount of ownership for them and higher ownership than their chances of being a top stack.
Yeah. So actually, when I looked at it most recently, though, they were actually coming out a little bit under-owned, at least on
DraftKings.
Fanduel,
it's a little bit over, I think.
Okay. But even so, the way that I'll go about building, about even 6.6% projected odds to be top stack, 6.9% ownership share. So about neutral, but to your point, a little bit over-owned right now on DraftKings on the latest update. But even so, just because Danny Duffy is going so wildly over-owned, that's still a spot that I'd want to get to, because Danny Duffy, and look at it this way. If Danny Duffy pitches really well, the Rays are obviously going to do poorly. But if Danny Duffy's going to be 40% owned and he doesn't pitch well, like it's going to have to be because the Rays are at least somewhat viable as a stack. So I kind of go hand in hand with number one. I weigh the top stacks tool really, really heavily when I build my lineups. But then also the top pitchers tool. I'm looking at which pitchers are being underowned and then trying to boost some of the offenses that I see going against a pitcher that I think is just wildly too much ownership.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And I think there's enough value pricing here on the Rays that, they're going to pick up some amount of ownership as some of the guys we talked about. The bottom of the order, I just have to say, though, looks pretty bad against lefties, at least the projected lineup that I have here. Zunino, Wendell, Adames, Brent Phillips. None of these guys have really shown a whole lot against lefty pitching. I guess Adames has had a little bit of pop, but for the most part, not great results. Is there any of these cheap Rays that you see yourself getting to? These guys who are going to be pretty much entirely unknown. I guess Austin Meadows also going to be unknown. People never like to play the lefty-lefty matchup, but he's been fine enough where I wouldn't run away from him. But do you see yourself getting into these lower owned Rays as a way to get different with this Rays stack? Just, I guess, try to get different from any of the people who are targeting going against Danny Duffy and the chalk pitcher of the day.
So let's see. What are some of the ownerships here? What is Mike Berceau owned at? Because to me, he's the guy that
he's at
looks
14
like
on DK.
14 on DK. So that's probably about fair. And then on DraftKings, where he's cheaper, I assume that he's fairly popular there as well. So he wouldn't fit your question of being a lower owned bat, but he's still somebody I think to get to. The ends of the order guys, there's not one that really stands out. But like I said, I think still if you're making 5-man Rays stacks, I still think you're getting enough leverage just because the ownership on Danny Duffy is so high that I'm not too concerned about the individual ownership of any Tampa Bay bats.
Okay, that's fair. Anything else on this side for you? Do you want to move on to the Kansas City part of the equation?
No, we can move on to KC.
All right, so Josh Fleming going against Kansas City. Fleming, a left-handed pitcher who's going to be a cheap play, I guess. Can theoretically be a pivot to Danny Duffy, though I don't know that I see anything with Fleming that would really indicate wanting to be there heavy. Only an 18% K rate in his 150 batter sample size since 2020. Not giving up a lot of home runs, but still more than league average of 4% on run rate. Has actually had some really bad results against fellow lefties, a 295 batting average and a 7% home run rate, but you'd expect that to come down a little bit. I do think that Fleming, to me, I wouldn't mind getting him in some lineups just because he's such a direct price point pivot on Danny Duffy that I think if there's some way that he hangs in and gets decent results at 1% ownership, not a bad play. But Fleming, to me, Greg, looks mostly bad. And I think you can make the case for the Kansas City lineup more. The one thing that Fleming has going for him is that there are 6 guys who strike out above league average in the Royals lineup. So do you have any thoughts on Fleming, or would you rather just talk about the Royals hitters?
So let me look at his pitch counts, because he's not somebody I expect to work very deep into the game. His outings so far this year have been 2 innings, 3 2/3 innings, and 5 innings. So maybe not just total opener to the point where I think 2 innings was probably a little bit extreme to open the season, but I don't think he's going to be somebody who's regular pitching 5-6 innings. So easy enough for me to avoid him just because of that. I think that this is going to be a game that the Rays do go to their bullpen pretty heavily in, but then on the Royals side, it just looks like they're going pretty over-owned here. 8% ownership share on DraftKings with only a 6% chance of being the top scoring team. And then on Fanduel, KC is once again a little more fairly owned, about 6% odds of being top stack, but also 6% ownership. So nothing here really stands out to me. And certainly on DraftKings, they look like they're being rostered way too heavily.
Yeah, Fleming only going about, as Greg mentioned, about 4.5 innings per start, or per stint rather, and 23% fly ball rates. The main thing that jumps out to me is not giving up a lot of home run power so far and has kept that ball down. But yeah, Kansas City, enough hitters here where I think getting some here being with the field is not crazy, but I agree they don't really stand out meaningfully. And Fleming, one of those guys in the Rays kind of organization, wouldn't shock me if he became a lot better. Wouldn't shock me if he just kind of stayed mediocre and limiting damage. So yeah, that's sort of the equation here. Let's keep going here because we got a couple more games to hit on. Hit that like button, guys. We appreciate it a bunch, whether you are a Cardinals fan or a Cardinals hater like I am. Hit that like button right now. It's funny because I really have no regional reason to hate the Cardinals. It's just something that's developed over the last couple seasons. And now I just have to dig my heels in, I guess, and make that one of my bits. Texas, though, 3.1 implied runs against Dylan Bundy. And Dylan Bundy, a pitcher who has shown some signs of life in the Angels organization, 27% K rate since last season. The numbers looking a little better, does struggle against stolen bases. So maybe there's there's some upside here. But Greg, we know we like targeting against the Rangers every single slate. They have been so bad for the most part. Only 4 guys who strike out above league average in this lineup against righties. So that's one thing I guess you could say is maybe a credit to them. But I think Dylan Bundy at his price point, another guy I'd rather find $700 against a Dylan Bundy rather than playing a guy like Danny Duffy. And it seems like you're on the same page.
Yeah, for sure. And then our top pitchers tool really bears that out. So Dylan Bundy, who at least on DraftKings picking up slightly less ownership than Danny Duffy, but also has much better odds being the top scoring pitcher on the slate. So Bundy has about 1% less ownership, but he has 27.5% chance of odds of being the top scoring pitcher of the day, whereas Danny Duffy only has 21% odds of being the top scoring pitcher on the day. So to me, Dylan Bundy at home, really favorable matchup against Texas, who's been one of the worst offense in baseball for the last few years. They strike out a whole bunch. So to me, I think Dylan Bundy on a points per dollar basis is overall the best pitching play of the day.
Yep, I think that's where I am at too. And also here's one from Eric Smith again, my friend in the chat, who's I think I'm turning against me more by the minute. Let's see whose opinion should I go with on Duffy, Spags or Alex? I'll take Alex. Well, Eric Smith, good news for you. He does have Dylan Bundy even projected better than Danny Duffy. So have no fear. Your precious Alex is also on the same page as me here. That Dylan Bundy is a better pitcher than Danny Duffy, and he also probably thinks the Cardinals suck. I know you can ask him yourself, but that would just be my thought here. Any Rangers love for you at all? I guess Greg, given the fact that they are a team that still has a 6% chance of being the top stack, a little bit less ownership expected. And at some point they are going to get, have a better hitting day. They've had a few here and there that have shown some ability. Any Rangers interest at all? I just they do stink, but they have the potential certainly to have decent days in a park that also is going to give up a little more hitting production as well.
No, not really for me. I mean, if you're going, I'm going to be really heavy on Dylan Bundy today. So throwing 1 or 2 stacks in as a hedge just against Bundy, if you're going really heavy on him, that's not really an issue. But for me, way more interest in the Dylan Bundy side than the Texas side.
Yep, same thing for me here. So here's an interesting one with the Angels, 4.9 implied runs, one of the better totals on the slate, 13% top stack odds, one of the better numbers there. They do look a little bit overowned, but they're going against Kohei Irihara, who has been unbelievably bad in his starts so far. Only faced 57 batters over the last season and change, but 12% K rate, 1 whip. So that's the good thing for him, but really just not getting strikeouts, not avoiding hard contact at all. Also not getting batters to miss even a little bit. I feel like the Angels here seem to be a team that you have to target, but there's a world, I guess, where Arhara could sort of just regress to normalcy here because the numbers are so low that you have to think that they are just going to get better because he is a major league pitcher. Do you have any thoughts on Arhara here? Because he's cheap and he does pitch about 4.5 innings a game. So I feel like there's some way here that he could extract value and then you would immediately get leverage on the highest owned team on the slate, though. It's a pretty low probability offering. I would admit to that too.
Yeah, that's going to be no thanks for me. The Angels are the Angels, by the way, going so overowned on DraftKings. So I think they're in a good enough spot that I can't avoid them entirely, but I'm going to be fairly significantly underweight to them as a stack. We have them with 12.5% chance being the top overall scoring team on the slate, but 16.5% ownership share. So just based on that, I'm going to have to be pretty significantly underweight to the Angels as a stack. Where I'll have more interest in them is just one-offs. So Mike Trout to me is going to be a pretty high priority play. Shohei Ohtani, who just never gets priced up on DraftKings, it does not matter what he does. He could hit 5 home runs in 3 games, and Ohtani be like, yeah, all right, 4,400 now. There's his salary never moves on DK. So Ohtani's expensive on FanDuel, but pretty significantly underpriced on DK still.
Yeah, I think Trout, Walsh jump out to me. Very big power numbers against righties. Walsh, obviously a lot smaller sample size for him, but still 305 ISO. Trout, it's honestly crazy the long-term sample size for Trout, where he still has a 380 ISO versus righties, and that's out. He's basically averaging a home run every at bat that he goes up there in terms of his power. It's just very strong numbers with Trout, and I think that's something that certainly hard to ignore on the slate, whether the ownership is going to be as heavy for the Angels or not. I guess the one thing is, would you be interested in any 3-man stacks of the Angels, or are you only taking one-offs because of the fact that it does seem like every possible permutation, unless you're going to Albert Pujols, is going to be pretty decently owned, at least on DraftKings?
I have a lot of 2-man stacks of Angels in 5-2-1 lineups. That's where I have them utilized the most in my current build right now. Ohtani is overall my most rostered hitter on DraftKings. And then Trout is the pay-up option that I rostered the most. So I think that's probably my most commonly used 2-man stack. The other thing also, Ohtani first base and outfield eligibility. So a lot of flexibility for him on DK. But yeah, I mean, as one-off guys here, Ohtani, Trout is popping up for me a ton. Let's see, who are the other guys? David Fletcher, just because he's cheap enough and he's in a good lineup spot. So those are the three Angels bats that I have the most exposure to.
All right. So, yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. Let's keep it going here. We got Milwaukee, 2.9 implied runs against Joe Musgrove, who is the pay-up option on the slate, and Musgrove's numbers. In case you are still thinking about him through the prism of the longer-term sample size, he has been a different man over the last season and change. 34% K rate, under a 1 whip, just 0.99 whip for him, 2.76 xFIP. So the numbers here, the swinging strike rate too, the chase rate up enough where you could sort of talk yourself into these numbers being sustainable for Musgrove. He's also facing a lineup for Milwaukee. No Christian Yelich projected to be in, and 8 guys who strike at above league average. I know we talked about Musgrove being sort of a pay-up option that you weren't the most in love with, Greg, but I do feel like the numbers here, the projection as well from Osmo, a 20-point projection, still not crazily ahead of a guy like Dylan Bundy, but enough ahead that I do think Musgrove is a pay-up option I'd want the most on the slate, and certainly more than paying down for a guy like Duffy in case it's a construction people are going to try just going extra cheap. I feel like Musgrove's numbers, though, really amazing and really impressive. And he was never a bad pitcher in terms of the longer term sample size, but now adding really monster strikeout ability in a way that may be unsustainable. Maybe it's there to stay. I think that's sort of up to you guys to decide how you want to play it. I do think I'm more inclined to think it's here to stay, maybe not at 34% K rate, but if he hangs out at around 30%, I think he could still pay off that price tag on not that big of a slate.
So here's just the general thought for the future. Anytime a pitcher leaves the Pirates and they go somewhere else, just get exposure to them in DFS. You play yearly fantasy leagues, draft them. Like every pitcher that's left their organization with any bit of talent has immediately become like a very viable fantasy option. Like recent years now, Garrett Cole, Joe Musgrove, even Trevor Williams is pitching reasonably well this season. I'm sure there's
Chris Archer though. That's the one that disproves it.
Well, no, Chris Archer went to the Pirates,
but then he went away from him, didn't he? Didn't he go back to the Rays?
But I'm only for a couple of starts now.
Okay, I don't know. I just wanted to disprove your theory real fast. But that's
why. But anybody. Let's say anybody who comes up through the Pirates organization with any bit of talent and is just kind of mediocre there, then goes elsewhere. They just become a fantasy star. And Joe Musgrove so far this year, he's been really good. He had the first no-hitter in Padres history last week. And I think on DraftKings, to me, the ideal cash combination for a pitcher is Dylan Bundy and Joe Musgrove. Musgrove is currently my second most rostered pitcher in my build behind Dylan Bundy. That still gets me a little bit underweight to Musgrove just because he's so popular. It's hard for me to get over 40% on him just because he's so expensive. But yeah, I mean, he's still a pretty high priority play for me on the slate.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's hard to debate it too much that, like even if you don't think he's a great pitcher, he's in a great spot. And I think that's really the main thing here. Again, 8 guys striking about above league average is one of the larger numbers you'll see for the most part. And just not a lot of guys also even hit that competently. Like Keston Hiura's a pretty good hitter, has power versus righties. But besides that, there's not a single guy I think you could point to here. Maybe Jackie Bradley, but nobody who you're like, oh, this guy's going to, is legitimately good and is going to make it tough on Musgrove. Just a lot of strikeouts, a lot of guys who don't have a ton of power, a lot of guys who don't even create runs with WRC plus either. So I just don't see a lot of hitting love here, but any interest at all in the Brewers lineup with 2.9 implied runs for them?
So just for contrarian purposes, they do look like they're going under-owned, I mean. So on DraftKings, we have them with a 4% chance of being the top scoring team on the slate, but only picking up 1.5% ownership. So just because Musgrove is so expensive and he's going a little bit over-owned, I think that the Brewers are worth as a contrarian stack just because they are the lowest owned team on the slate by a really wide margin.
Yeah, no, that's fair. 4% chance of being the top stack, only 2% ownership. So if you are just playing a top stack stool straight away, maybe you get some. But yeah, I think I would definitely prefer the Musgrove side of the equation, just given the fact on DraftKings, not to keep beating up on Danny Duffy throughout the entire show, but Danny Duffy projects more ownership than Musgrove. Granted, they are at different price points, but I would just rather have Musgrove, 9 times out of 10, I would think. This other side too, another pitching friendly spot here for Brandon Woodruff. He's been also very good over the last season and changed 31% K rate under a 1 whip as well. And he's going against a Padres lineup that does have certainly some guys have been hitting well. Cronenworth really sort of proven that he is not just a replacement level dude over his recent stretch. And some of those games without Tatis, he was basically carrying the team. But I really don't have a strong feel for Woodruff or for the Padres. I think being with the field on both sides of the equation seems about right for me. Woodruff's price tag, I feel like just a bit less appealing than a guy like Dylan Bundy. And the Padres lineup, not a great run total for the prices they're at, I guess, for really everybody besides Cronenworth. So which side of this equation do you like more, Greg? Do you like Woodruff? Do you like Padres? Or are you just kind of with me that it seems like being with the field on both is the right move?
I'm about with the field on both, except I do prefer Woodruff to Padres stacks as a whole, just because the pitching options are so weak on the slate and Woodruff has so much strikeout upside. Absolutely don't like the matchup at all, especially with Tatis now back in the Padres lineup, which he kind of snuck up in me being back in the lineup. Like, I assumed he was going to be out for a pretty long extended period of time. Then all of a sudden it was like, hey, Tatis is back in the lineup, and then he just hit a homer immediately. So I guess that shoulder injury was kind of much ado about nothing, at least for now. But anyway, Brandon Woodruff, like I said, the matchup very, very difficult, but just because of the strikeout upside, he's somebody who's going to be in, probably like a quarter of my lineups or so.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Yeah, Woodruff, certainly the arm talent's been there, as I mentioned. Also under a 200 batting average, not giving up a lot of home runs, 2.5% home run rate, and that's going back to 2019. So there's not a lot of power given up by Woodruff, and the strikeout upside. Those are the kind of guys you normally want to target at pitcher. Last game on the slate, we got the Dodgers getting 4.9 implied runs against Justice Sheffield. On the other side, Seattle 3.6 implied runs against Dustin May. And the Dodgers side, sort of the same thing as it always is. They're going to look good in pretty much every slate. I think they're still, to me, being played a little bit more than they should be sometimes. And I think the top stack ownership is going to be actually right in line with the actual chances of being a top stack on DraftKings. 18% chance of the Dodgers being the top stack, along with about 18% ownership, a little bit less than that. But Greg, I feel like the Dodgers, we know what they are. You should be probably playing them on every slate. They're also probably going to be a little bit owned on every slate. And Justice Sheffield, I feel like probably not a lot of interest in going there at all.
No interest in Justice Sheffield. By the way, I've never seen, at least I can't remember a team being this appropriately owned, where very specifically the Dodgers 17.8% chance of being the top scoring team of the day. Ownership as a team, 17.8%. So exactly properly owned on the Dodgers, but definitely a team to be on. They're by far the team most likely odds to be the top scoring team of the day. So a priority play for me. And then Dustin May is my favorite GPP pitcher on the slate. I don't really understand the ownership here. The price tag at 9,700, I guess that's expensive, except he's been one of the top pitching prospects for years. It's starting to look like it's coming together for him a little bit, and only projecting for 5% ownership right now. Like, I assume that's just incorrect, and that's going to look different as the day goes on. But if Dustin May is actually only going to be 5% owned, then he's the best tournament play of the day.
What are his pitch counts recently? Because the average innings are what would throw me off here, where I just feel like he does tend to get a quicker hook, and is over the longer term sample, like a 3.6 innings pitched per game is not the best. But I know they do kind of go in waves. I didn't check the pitch counts before the show.
Yeah. So the other thing with Dustin May also is that he served as an opener at one point in his career. Sure. I don't think that's an issue now. His first two starts, he's only thrown 85 and 71 pitches. But also his last start, he was getting roughed up a little bit. But I mean, just the fact that his first start of the year, he went 85 pitches. He also worked fairly deep into games in spring training. So, I mean, I think like 80 to 90 pitches and like 5 to 6 innings is a reasonable expected output for him. And then you just consider the matchup is really favorable against Seattle, and that there's just really weak pitching options on the slate. So if he's actually only going to be 5% owned, that's way too low.
I would prefer Musgrove by a pretty decent margin, at least on DK, where it's only a $500 difference. And like Dustin May's strikeout rate, like I think the short innings pitch, or, the quick hook the Dodgers normally have with their guys, is one concern. But May too, only a 22% K rate since 2019, only a 21.6% K rate over the last season. Like that, to me, I would just favor Musgrove and try to buy in on Musgrove, having made the changes that are going to keep him sustainably throwing those strikeouts compared to May. But I guess relative to Musgrove, like how strong do you feel about May here? Because I think you have to compare those two, because they're the only two at the price points that you're really comparing.
Yeah, so I have more exposure to Dustin May. However, Dustin May is also picking up nearly 40% ownership. So when you look at the difference in the two, where it's
Musgrove's picking up 40%.
Yeah, Musgrove's picking up almost 40% ownership. So yeah. I think the exact number was 38.6 off the top of my head, and then I had Musgrove in 35% of my lineup. So yeah, like Musgrove is a very significantly owned pitcher for me, my second highest roster pitcher behind Dylan Bundy, but it still is me underweight to the field on Musgrove right now. And then Dustin May, I have in about 20% of my lineups. That's 4x the field. So it's kind of weird. Like, I don't really know how to explain those numbers. Like, I have more exposure to Joe Musgrove. However, relative to the slate, I'm more leveraged on Dustin May. So Dustin May actually becomes a more important play for me for that reason. So now, talking about his strikeout rates, it's true they were low last year. So we also have to consider that this is a 23-year-old pitcher who's one of the best pitching prospects in baseball, and also is really, really good stuff. So he's opened the season with a 99.2 average 92.2 mile per hour average fastball velocity. And so far, at least this season, he's striking out 12.19 hitters per 9 innings. And then you look at his projections going forward, whether it be Zips, Steamer, all of these projections have him striking out a little over 1 hitter per inning. So to me, everything points towards him being a much more prolific strikeout guy this year. And then also it fits the eye test. If you just watch him throw, like he's throwing wiffle balls out there, ball going 99 miles per hour and moving all over the place. He's struggled to deceive hitters a little bit in the past, I think, but he's also only 23. And given his outlook as a prospect, I just have to think he's going to get better going forward. And I'd rather be early to that than late, especially when he's only projecting for 5% ownership.
That's fair. And I do think, I would like to see some change in the numbers here for a swinging strike rate or chase rate, because those are still pretty flat. 9.3% swing strike rate over the last season, only a 9.1% swing strike rate since 2019. Like, I just don't see the signs of life yet, but I do think a matchup like this one against Seattle, 7 guys to strike out above league average in their lineup, maybe this is where he makes his bones. But I just think relative to the price points, $500 difference, I would just much prefer and feel safer with Joe Musgrove. But I get it. I get believing in the arm talent. I just think, to me, so far, Justin May grades out more as a guy who's going to get through starts and not give up a lot of damage and mostly keep things in pocket, which is an ability in its own right. But I think for fantasy, I haven't seen the strikeout upside. So I guess, you could sort of buy in early like Greg is doing, or you could be a little more conservative and go to a guy like Musgrove who's started to prove it out. Any Seattle at all for you? They do seem overowned as a top stack, though they are going to have a higher chance of being the top value stack on the slate compared to their ownership right now. But any thoughts on Seattle at all? I feel like you can sort of make the case for them because it's a short enough slate, but that's really the main way you make a case for them.
Nope. I don't really. I'm going to be overexposed to Dustin May, and then Seattle, just a bad offense that also is picking up a little bit of ownership. I mean, we have them with 5.5% projected ownership right now, and 5% odds being the top stack on the slate. So not a spot that I'm really looking to get to.
All right, Greg, give people the final plug here. You are doing live before lock at 3:45 Eastern today for MLB, so you'll be back giving one more take. So tell the people what to expect there on that show with you and Max.
One more thing, though. I should have brought this up to you before. I'll end the show overall, just favorite pitching play and top stack on the slate. Just something we could cut for social media and get it up on Twitter. So we have a nice little video. So
okay,
give me yours first. Overall, what's your top stack, top pitcher on the slate? And then I'll go to close this out.
I will say for top stack, I would go to the Angels. I think they are my preferred stack on the day. And Joe Musgrove, we talked about the strikeout rate for him. I'm buying it on the uptick, at least keeping it going one more day. Gets a Milwaukee lineup that looks terrible. So Musgrove and the Angels for me, my top pitcher and top stack.
Yeah, so for me, it's still going to be the Dodgers. They are about appropriately owned, except we just have them with such higher odds of being the highest scoring team on the slate than any other team. We have them with right now 17.8% chance on DraftKings being the top scoring team of the day, which just by far trumps everybody else. And then my favorite pitching play is going to be Dylan Bundy. To me, it's not a knock against Joe Musgrove. He's currently the pitcher I have the second most exposure to, but Dylan Bundy just being cheaper, really favorable matchup against the Texas Rangers. He's the guy I'm going to have the most exposure to.
And we agree, Danny Duffy and the Cardinals are trash. So put that in the clip too for social. I think that's the main thing. All right, now give him the plugs, Greg.
All right, follow me on Twitter, Ehrenberg Dfs, and I'll be back to do MLB Live Before Lock with our friend Max, and that'll be in a few hours from now. And then we'll really know what exactly all my ownership, exactly what it ends up being, and then also we'll get a take from somebody else as well.
Yeah, so tune into that coming up in a bit. I'll be on the Four Corners short form video coming out probably within the next couple hours. And then the tip off, I believe, is at 12 Pacific today. I don't know. But if you're subscribed to the channel and hitting the notification bell, you'll know before I do. So make sure you do that. And of course, make sure to go to awesemo.com/join. Check out all the packages on there for all the sports. For the MMA, use the promo code UFC261 to save some money on that deal as well before Usman Masvidal. Follow at Chris Spags. Follow at Ehrenberg Dfs. Follow at Awesemo_com. And shout out to our producer, Tyler, tolerating us as always. We appreciate you guys for watching this one. Catch you guys later. Bye.